This oral history is comprised of black musicians and their perspectives and stories in relation to Cleveland's local music scene. You will hear Joe Moshberg talk about Cleveland's jazz history, Chris Lewis talk about hip hop's Cleveland history, and Lamont Thomas about punk's Cleveland history.
Well, for many years, Cleveland was a major stop on the big band circuit. All the big bands would come in and play at the Palace Theater for a week at a time between showings of movies. They would show a movie, take an hour off, and the band would come on and play. And this went on from the early 30s well into the 50s. These bands were in every week, a different band every week. And you name any band, and they were all there at some point or other. And an awful lot of the old musicians I've interviewed have said what they did, they went down to listen to these bands at the Palace Theater. Sometimes it was a great band, they would cut school that day and spend all day long there watching the movie several times and so they could hear the band several times. So they were influenced greatly by these bands that came into Cleveland. And I think that set it off, plus the fact that old Central High School on 55th Street, which was then called Wilson Avenue, uh, had a very active music department in the 30s and 40s. And an awful lot of the people who became important in jazz were alumni of that program at Old Wilson or at Old Central High School.
So this is before Bone. We had a lot of local groups come out. So there was pretty much Brothers for the Struggle. That was probably one of the first commercial artists that came out of Cleveland. And then it was followed up with MC Brains, who made a hit on the radio with Oochie Coochie. And then once I got probably in my senior year, then Bone probably launched out between 96 97. And that's when Cleveland really started to take off as a city that could produce rap music. So back then, we would pretty much do a lot of underground music because the underground sound was very popular back then, and everybody wanted to start from the roots and foundation from underground to go to, or if they wanted to cross over to the mainstream. So, yeah, that's pretty much Cleveland back in the 90s and 2000 was pretty much looking for a gateway to get into the mainstream, which produced a lot of local artists.
Well, yeah, man. I mean, early '70s, super fringe. I mean, everybody knows about, Electric Eels, Rocker from the Tombs, Perubu, and Mirrors and Styrenes and that shit now. But back then, just like any underground thing, 20, 30 people checking it out initially, a few little records get cut here and there, maybe some traveling, some touring. But I mean, it's common knowledge now. Whereas I worked in a record store with very knowledgeable people, so when certain rare Cleveland records would come over the counter or whatever, it was a point of interest, and the fellas would explain to me what it was. Oh, I remember when the single came out. This is Heart of Darkness. This is Peruba. This is Ohio. This is the shit. You know what I mean? I was lucky enough to be around dudes that could explain it all with great knowledge as to what it was, even though everything was so underground. And now, there's the compilations and the internet and stuff. You get the gist that Cleveland had a fertile underground rock
In this section, we have Joe Moshberg, Latoya Kent, and Chris Lewis describing what some of Cleveland's musical venues were like.
The Majestic Hotel was the Black Hotel in Cleveland on 55th Street at Central. And all the touring black musicians who came to town stayed there. It's like the Howard Hotel or the Matthews Hotel on Howard Street in Akron, the same sort of thing. Ellington and Basie and all the others, Ella, stayed at these hotels because of what segregation was in those days. And later on, a guy named Duke Jenkins was playing at the Majestic. They started doing, they had sort of like a nightclub at the hotel as early as the early 30s. And Duke Jenkins later on was the mainstay playing at the Majestic Hotel. And invariably, these traveling, touring national names who stayed at the hotel would come in and sit in with him. At one point, they were having what they called their Monday matinees. They had sessions early Monday morning, jazz, like 7 o'clock Monday morning, an ungodly hour for jazz.
Yes.
But they had this, and some of these national people come in and sit in and play with the Duke Jenkins trio, I guess it was at that point, or maybe it was a little more than three. But Duke told the story. He was sitting there singing a song one day with his eyes closed, and it was a song that Nancy Wilson had recorded. And as he finished up the first chorus, he heard this girl's voice say, "Can I sing the second chorus?" It was Nancy Wilson, who walked in and wanted to join him.
Around 93, I started writing songs. Being a writer and being a singer and a performer, it got me more into the music scene in Cleveland. And back then, it was very segregated. So the music scene in Cleveland, you had your West Side people. Back then we had a club called the Brillo Pad. So back then, there was a guy who was a DJ. He still is. His name is Mozzie. And he would bring music from all over the world. So we got influenced in listening to like Massive Attack and Portishead and PJ Harvey and Bjork and all these kind of artists that Clevelanders weren't really into at that time. But then on the east side, most of the people that were performers performed on the east side. The only other venue on the west side that performers were into was a place called Speaking Tongues, which is down the street. It was on Lorraine, I think around 44th or 41st, somewhere around there. On the east side, there was the Grog Shop, and the Grog Shop was in a different location. It was on Mayfield, corner of Mayfield and Coventry. And then Euclid Tavern was another place that people performed. But back then, it was not a lot of like soul music or hip hop music. It was mostly rock music. So a lot of times, performing in those clubs, I was the only black person there with my band. I was the lead singer of a band. All the musicians in that particular band were white, and that was. I felt like if I didn't have that dynamic with the other players, I probably wouldn't have played in some of those places. It wasn't as open in that time. I don't think there were a lot of black bands that just were together and performing in that kind of way. So I like how the progression of things have happened over the years, where you get a lineup and it's all different types of acts. It might be a hip hop act and then a rock act and then a punk act and then a soul act, all in the same venue performing on the same bill. It wasn't really like that then. It was very, very different. And I don't think it was by choice or anything like that. I think it was just what was available.
So in hip hop scene in Cleveland, you did have a lot of like underground events at the Grog Shop in Coventry and Cleveland Heights. So they were back down on the corner of Mayfield and Coventry before they moved up to Euclid Heights in Coventry. That was a pretty small bar and grunge shop, which they always had local or underground hip hop artists. There was also the the Coliseum on Euclid that hosted a lot of hip hop shows back in the day. That a lot of the rap groups used to go there that were local, perform at the Coliseum. Then you probably had the bigger stages that were more mainstream. So in the Cleveland environment, there really wasn't too much of a broad span of places like today for hip hop, but back then it was pretty much more so the grog shop, your high school front yard, or somewhere at an event where there was a mainstream hip hop show, like at the front row.
Here we have Lamont Thomas and Latoya Kent describing the feel of the Cleveland music scene as well as how Cleveland has impacted their music.
Oh, it made me want to make street music. In Columbus, people get away with a lot of college indie rock type shit. There hasn't been a hardcore scene there since the mid to late '80s. Where you got all of this shit going up here. You got R&B types. You got excellent MCs. You got really gnarly hardcore punk situations where motherfucking bodies are flying and the energy is peak. And with all, it's just a different energy. Like people around here in Columbus, you could fuck off in a library all day. You could, work at a record store and then go and drink beer at a happy hour or whatever. And, that's a full day. Here, you got to punch the clock. You can't just walk from your boy's house to your job, or you can't just, it's not so simple. It's not a college town per se, where Columbus is built entirely around the college and shit. A lot of people go there to go to college. Here, there's motherfuckers from here, there's people that move here, but you gotta work, and that makes, when you finally do get to your art and your recreation, your creativity, it just makes it that more enjoyable, because you can't just survive around here by being lazy and shit. People will call you on that shit here, whereas down there it's like, oh, that's so-and-so. Yeah, he doesn't work that much, but he's a good guitar player and boop, boop, boop. It's like, nah. He's a great guitar player, but this motherfucker's a bum, and get him out of here. And Cleveland motherfucker will tell you that. Columbus motherfucker will wait until you leave and then tell everybody else that you did.
I grew up in Cleveland. I left Cleveland and I moved to California, and I lived in California for 8 years. And I noticed that the content of my music was different there than it was here. The vibe in Cleveland is very heavy.
Yeah.
So it causes for a lot of
Somber.
yeah, but like backlash, like you want to change and you feel it, and you're looking around yourself and you're like, damn, I wish it was different. I wish I wish people could have more of this, or I wish I could have more of that in my family. And so it puts you into a place where you become way more lyrical. When I was in California, my songs were literally like 2 minutes. It was like heavy, like fast punk, and I'd write a verse, a chorus, and then I would repeat it about 4 times. And then when I got back home, RA was like, you gotta do more, you gotta write more, like you can't just have one verse and one chorus. I was like, damn, now I gotta like really write. But the environment has so much, you almost feel the words like in the atmosphere. And then I think there's lots of things under that water, so I think that has like an influence on like our art here in Cleveland too.
I want to thank Joe Moshbrook, Chris Lewis, Lamont Thomas, and Latoya Kent for the cooperation and participation with this oral history. Thank you.